Do you ever feel like you're being watched? It can happen when you're alone or with others. You feel this indescribable primal emotion, sort of like a mental itch that just tells you you're being stalked by something. This is exactly how I felt on the drive into Hiram Ministry National Forest. For those who are unfamiliar, this is a beautiful, massive park that's bordered almost entirely by Lake Michigan. I have many fond memories of my experiences here, but the story I'm about to share falls into an entirely different category. I was with my girlfriend of about 6 months at the time. We'll call her Diane. She was driving as we pulled off the interstate and neared the smaller roads that led into the designated camping area of the park. Originally, we planned to set up our campsite in the spot, but upon arrival, we noticed it was very crowded. After a bit of deliberating, we opted to grab our camping gear, which was only a minimalist tent, a few days' worth of food, and some bottled water, and we hiked a mile or so inland away from where the other campers would be situated. After all, we came out here to have some intimacy, and being surrounded by strangers cracking beers and partying did not really fit that bill. It was around 6 o'clock when we finally arrived at a suitable campground. It was a clearing just up a small hill, about 15 meters in diameter, surrounded by thick woods on every side, including where we entered from. We first heard it when we were setting up the tent, a thick, deliberate scream reminiscent of an animal in a good deal of pain. It rang out across the clearing. "What the hell?" Diane muttered. The sound ended as abruptly as it started, and almost as if it was in a cartoon, a flock of birds in the trees overhead took off, all flying back the direction we had come from. "What was that?" I asked, a barely noticeable quiver in my voice. "I don't know, maybe a deer or something," she replied. After giving her theory, Diane continued to pitch the tent, and I did too, though I found the sound hard to shake. After the tent was set up, Diane suggested we better get ready and get this firewood started before it gets too dark. As there was no existing fire pit, we had to kinda make one. I remember saying that I thought I saw good material just outside the clearing on our way in, when a strange noise came from overhead. It was gone in an instant. It sounded like a very large bird swooping just over our tent. We both heard it, and immediately looked up and around the area, though we could not see the thing that made the sound. Whatever this thing was, we didn't know. All we could tell was that this was something very large and big. Fast forward a few hours, and the sun was setting. After a rather grueling wood haul, we were able to get a proper fire going, and we were stereotypically toasting marshmallows over the flame while casually flirting and telling ghost stories. As I was biting into my charred sweet, me and her once again heard that scream. This time, it was much closer than before. The noise rang out in a way that made my ears throb, and I had to cover them with my hands. It lasted longer this time too, going for about 5 or 6 seconds. "Diane, what is that?" she yelled, as if trying to ask whatever made the scream. Though the sound was unnerving, I was more annoyed than scared at that point. "A real a-hole of a deer," we both laughed. "I swear if it does that while I'm asleep, I'm just going to scream back." Our jokes dissolved the tension quickly, and we went back to toasting our marshmallows, watching the sky dissolve from purple into a deep blue ocean. The rest of that night was uneventful until we went to sleep sometime around 12 or 1 in the morning. I woke up to a loud thud outside, as if something heavy was dropped. "What was that?" She was still groggy, so I jostled her arm. "Diane, wake up! I think something's outside." "What? What do you mean, an animal or something?" She continued to lie there, so I said something to get her attention. "I'm scared." She sat right up in the tent, and I could see with my phone flashlight that she was very tired. "Okay, you want me to go look?" "I guess." Without complaining, she got up out of the sleeping bag, taking my phone, and exited the tent. "Hello? Anyone out here?" she called jokingly as she shined her flashlight around the clearing. I watched her from the tent as she walked into the center of it, illuminating the area with the phone. Then, near the edge of the clearing, she spotted something. "Whoa, hey, come here!" I squinted, realizing I could barely see, and reached back to grab my glasses before getting out of the tent and walking over to her. This might sound strange, but the air felt heavy, like it does before a thunderstorm. There was also this faint smell of copper in the air. It grew stronger as I went over to her. Looking where she was shining the light, I saw what looked like a young fawn. At first I thought it was sleeping, completely unaware of us, until I saw the markings in its back. Deep in its fur were these gouges, about 2 feet apart. They were darkened, obviously soaked with blood. It looked almost as if the deer was picked up by some predatory bird. I found this confusing because I couldn't think of a prey bird around here that would be able to lift an animal that heavy off the ground. This thing was easily 50 pounds or more. "What the hell?" I said aloud. Even stranger, though, was the fact that the only markings on this animal were on its back. There were no other wounds, so whatever had done this to the deer didn't feed off it at all. It just killed it and left. "Babe, I really don't like this." Diane wrapped her arm around me, pulling me to her. I know. Let's get back to the tent. We'll get out of here as soon as the sun comes up." I nodded slowly, and we both began walking back to the tent. A few footsteps back, though, we heard a twig snapping. "Diane, shine the flashlight behind us," revealing nothing at first. She scanned the tree line, and to my horror, we saw something directly in front of us, maybe 20 feet away or so. It was a large humanoid figure. It glared at us, and whether it was because of the flashlight or this thing's natural disposition, its eyes appeared to be bright red glowing orbs. I was horrified. If I had to guess, I'd say the thing was between 8 and 10 feet tall. It was feathered in a deep gray coat. It stood, staring at us. It didn't seem to have a separated head, but rather, its eyes were just plastered on the top of its body, sort of like an owl. Both me and my partner were stunned as we looked at this thing. Whatever it was then that it extended its arms or wings, revealing a very wide wingspan. It seemed to flow from its entire body, much like a moth. Without warning, it screamed at us. The sound was unbearable, thick, heavy, and blood-curdling, like a fire alarm amplified by 100. I collapsed to the forest floor, clutching my ears, as Diane held me. The last thing I remember was her saying my name as my vision faded to black. When I awoke, I was in the back of our car. I was surprised and sat straight up. Diane spotted me in the rearview mirror. "I'm glad you're awake," she said. As she spoke, I noticed my ears were ringing a great deal. I clutched my head in pain. "What the hell happened?" I grew pale in the face, remembering the creature from the night before. She kept her eyes on the road as she said, "The thing, it took off almost as soon as you blacked out, like a jet. It was insane. I took you back to the tent and waited until it was dawn before I booked it." "You mean you carried me all the way?" "I tried to wake you up a few times, but you were out cold. It wasn't too bad anyway, but I had to leave the tent." I sighed before nodding slowly. "Money we'll never get back." I paused. "And thank you for protecting me." I saw her smile in the rearview mirror. Without another word, to this day, we're still together. As strange as it is, the events seem to bring us closer. We talk about it often, using it as an anecdote when friends come over. It's a very healthy way to process an ordeal like this. We've been living together for quite some time now, and I see marriage as a very realistic future for us. As for the creature itself, I'm still unsure what it was. Based on its behavior and its striking physical form, I'd have to say my best educated guess would be that we encountered the Mothman, a humanoid cryptid that is said to have the body of a moth with glowing red eyes. According to the folklore, it's commonly seen as an omen before a major disaster. I still think about that night often. Honestly, I don't know if I would still be alive right now to write this story if it wasn't for my partner. I was 27. I'm working at a Boy Scouts camp far up in the woods of very northerly Northern California. Where I worked, there was a large population of black bears, which for the most part were rather harmless and easy enough to scare away with a shot from a rifle. However, we had a very large number of Boy Scouts at this camp weekly, sometimes as many as 500 heads, with a lot of vastly spread out campsites. There's going to be a few campers who sleep with candy bars in their pockets and basically make themselves pre-packaged dinners, snacks for a bear. I tell you this, black bears love Reese's peanut butter cups. As part of staff, oftentimes I was scheduled for bear watch and basically strolled the entirety of the camp with a rifle, going from site to site, making my presence known as to ensure the bears wouldn't come anywhere near. One of these routine nights, everything was still, more quiet than usual. I remember finding it rather odd and unsettling. I just checked in on the camp furthest away from all other campsites. It was a good 1.5 miles away from base proper. As I'm strolling along the trail that runs beside the lake, I stop and take a number 1 unlighted joint that I had stashed away for such an occasion as being out by the lake at 2 a.m. As human beings, we have a natural gut feeling we must always adhere to for our survival. There was definitely a gut feeling I had that things were amiss. Not only was it unusually still and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and that I was most certainly not alone. I nervously took a few puffs from my J and then put it out, now being more aware of the unnerving sense in the air. I've been face to face with a bear. I've been stalked by a mountain lion. I've slept a little too close to it and have coyotes late in the night. But this was different. I didn't have the sense that I was in the presence of any of these animals. The smell was overwhelming. It didn't smell like any bear I've experienced. It was almost sour, but still musky. I'll never forget the smell. It's truly hard to accurately describe. As I reached for my flashlight before considering readying my rifle, a massive boom hit the ground, falling from the trees above me and nearly knocking me to my ass from the sheer force of it. I reached for my flashlight that had fallen to the ground as I heard something large and massive run away into the tree line up into the hill above. Immediately, I considered it was probably the biggest bear I'd ever come across, and black bears can be spooked easily, so at first I considered myself lucky. But as I lay there hyperventilating, shaking and quaking in my boots, I started to consider the sound of the beast running away. It didn't sound like the stride of a black bear in a flight. It sounded bipedal. It almost sounded human. I braced myself, stood up, and readied my rifle, released the safety, and shot upwards into the air toward the lake. It woke up many campers and the scoutmasters alike. I stood there for a good 10 minutes alone before a camp leader came, as well as other staff towards me. During that time, I had my flashlight out and was inspecting the scene. Whatever had dropped from the branch above fell from possibly 20 feet, and in its wake had torn off the branches in the hill line that stood 13 feet from the ground. And some smaller trees were bent almost all the way into the ground. I have never seen a bear do that, that's for sure. By the time some of the staff and some concerned campers arrived, everyone was stumped. Most campers, to comfort themselves, insisted it was just a bear. But I do know this: no bear running on all fours stands 13 feet tall, and no bear can run on 2 feet for 12 yards uphill on 2 legs. They just can't do that. We're all thinking it, so I'll say it. I think I encountered a Sasquatch that night. If not, I really don't know what it was. But I'm glad it was running away from me, and not at me. Because whatever that thing was, beast or man, it was gargantuan, and I would not have stood a chance had it decided to confront me. This takes place when I went to Mexico for summer vacation. I was 14 at the time, and like everyone else, I was curious about the legends and scary stories. Since I got there, my cousins would be telling me stories about strange things that would happen in abandoned houses down the block from my grandmother's house. The story that intrigued me the most was the one about a creature living in the town's lake that was the cause of a lot of drownings that happened in the past. My uncle, to this day, likes the outdoors, and when I am visiting, he used to take me hunting and fishing. One day, a friend of his invited us to go camping by the lake. He had plans of setting out a net from side to side and leaving it overnight and seeing what he caught in the morning. My uncle couldn't make it because of his job, and my grandma didn't let me go without my uncle. So he took off by himself and told us he will let us know if he caught anything in the morning. I stayed home, bummed out, waiting for my uncle to get off work so we could at least go out for some tacos. We took some to go and went home. At around 2 in the morning, we heard loud knocks outside the door. Now these knocks were like frantic banging, so it caught us off guard just a bit, as you could imagine. My grandma got up and went to check who it was, while my uncle was grabbing his machete. Outside the door was my uncle's friend. He was pale and had that look of terror. We asked him what was going on, and he only stuttered. We brought him inside and let him calm down. Once he did, my uncle asked him again what had happened. He told us that he ended up going fishing by himself and thought it was going to be a good night. The moon was bright, and you were able to see all around the lake, but he was having bad luck and not catching a single thing. So, after an hour of no luck, he decided to head back home. He said that since he wasn't catching anything, there was no point in setting up the tent. He got on his bike and started going around the lake to get to the trail to head back, when he spotted something at the edge of the lake. Something was coming out of the water. He didn't get scared at first, because he didn't know what he was looking at, and from far away, it looked kind of small. He thought it was probably an iguana or something like that. There are some that grow up to 3 feet in that town. So he kept pedaling and got near the trail, curious to see the lizard up close since the trail was going to pass where he saw the thing coming out. Once he did, he would forever regret it. He said that once he got close, the creature was still halfway out of the water. He only knows this because when he got close to this thing, he heard the tires making noise with the dirt, and this thing turned around to look straight at him with big red eyes. It started coming out of the water. He said the creature's scaly skin was shining with the light of the moon and was standing on 2 legs. Once it was out of the water, it had a tail like lizards do, except smaller, like a stump, about 6 feet long. This thing would have been, he said, if it didn't look him in the eyes. My uncle's friend wouldn't have believed this himself, but his reaction had him almost frozen in shock. He was able to snap out of it rather quickly, though, and started pedaling down the trail as fast as he could. Since my grandma's house is close to the lake, that was the reason why he stopped here instead of going home. The next day we were talking about it, and my grandma heard us talking. She said it was El Chavaran, an old legend about a fisherman making a deal with the devil and not keeping his promise. So the devil turned him into a monster as punishment, and throughout the years he's been the cause of people drowning close to the lake and the rivers nearby. I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long-dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days, and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight, and freaked out the adult leaders, and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names are lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, all those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well. A lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, my tent mate is a bit slow and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the prepackaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing potpourri fear of bears and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going on this scout ranch. You're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau just because of the geography and the environment. But forget the rules, 'cause we do. Anyway, we set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag, and head off to sleep. That night, though, was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder, and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain. Like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lightning, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social, and likely had mild autism in hindsight. But the next day we wake up and a ton of things popped red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange because yesterday we both saw forests. From when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part, though, the guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent, there were no trees anywhere, just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright, full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying, winged, pitch-black objects bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them, and that they were round. He dove back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did, and I was scared shitless. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself. This is my father's story. He and my grandparents were camping out by Lake Tahoe, and all day my grandpa said that they felt like they were being watched. My grandpa described a general feeling of just something not feeling right. That night they had built a big fire and had gotten in their tents, and they began to hear all strange noises. They described it as a wolf howling, but if it were 10 times deeper. My grandpa decided it would be best to keep the fire lit at night. My grandpa stayed up all night out of protection of his family and fear. At around 3:45, he says he opened the tent flap and looked outside to see what he says is the most terrifying thing he's ever seen. A large black humanoid figure walking circles around the fire. The thing had no distinguishable features, except for its giant pair of yellow eyes. Just then, my grandpa said an awful scent filled the air, like something had been rotting for over 8 years. The last thing my grandpa saw before he went back into the tent was the figure returning to the woods, and he saw 3 others exactly like the one he saw waiting for the figure. Grandpa loaded his gun, and he says nothing else happened, and they left the next day. The story still gives me nightmares to this day. My grandpa had a hunting buddy in the 70s who was basically a hermit in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. He was staying with him in his cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains during a hunting trip. No running water, no electricity, miles away from the nearest town or paved road. His cabin was built on stilts and on an incline. They had a 10-foot balcony from the base of the bottom of the stilts with no stairs or ladder to climb up on. My grandpa claims that he knew this man for a long time and said that he didn't have the personality to lie. I've also known my grandpa never to be one for BS. One night during the trip, they were relaxing at the cabin after a hunt, and his buddy tells him that Sasquatch is in the area and to be careful going out at night. Thinking he was pulling his leg, my grandpa chuckled and didn't think too much about it. His friend then put on a very serious face and grabbed a few pieces of fruit, bread, and jerky and placed them in a bowl. He took the bowl out to the balcony and set it on the edge and said, "It'll be empty by morning," and then went to bed. It was an open-floor, single-room cabin about 300 square feet. My grandpa had a cot set up near the balcony window and was awoken in the middle of the night by rustling outside. He peeked through the window and saw the bowl empty, and still to this day, claims he saw 4 fingers resting on the edge of his balcony just before letting go. He never went hunting in that area again. I was camping with my family and friends up in the mountains. sharing a tent with my older brother Luke and another friend called Evan. We weren't tired, and everyone retreated to their tents for the night. But the fire was dimming, and we were bored. So we went inside our tent to watch Adventure Time on my laptop. We all passed out after a few episodes, and I woke up sometime during the night into an episode of sleep paralysis. I have weird sleep habits, and experience sleep paralysis every few months or so. So for those of you who haven't had it, basically you're awake, but you can't move, and sometimes experience auditory and visual hallucinations. I was aware of this, so I didn't have a full-on heart attack when I started hearing shuffling noises outside my tent, which continued and got louder and closer until the fabric of the tent itself was being touched by something. My computer hadn't died yet, and I could see my surroundings in the dim light of the screen. I watched the fabric compress as something pushed against it sporadically about 4 feet off the ground, then moved around the tent towards me. I watched 3 distinct impressions follow this creature around the side of the tent. It looked like a claw. I was terrified and filled with adrenaline, but another part of me remained calm, assuring my body it was all a dream. I couldn't do anything, so my fear was pointless, but I continued to observe it in my sleep paralysis. The paralysis began to fade, and I realized I could no longer move. So, convinced I was dreaming, I reached over and shoved Luke awake. I tried to get him to look to see if there was really something out there, but I must have sounded like I was sleep-talking, because he just rolled over and went back to sleep, waving me off. Eventually, the rustling stopped, and I was tired and groggy enough that I fell back asleep. In the morning, I completely forgot about it. That's until my brother-in-law said to us, "It's a good thing we put the dog in the car last night. There was a bear here while we were sleeping." Dean pointed out the tree where we'd strung up our trash and saw the fresh gaping claw marks about 9 feet deep on the trunk. That hit me hard. I had seen the bear and calmly watched it test the fabric of my tent, 12 inches from my face. Hello, I need to get this experience off of my chest, since I know if I tell any of my friends or family, I would probably be blamed for seeking attention or something like that. So, I have been a Boy Scout for a while. I'm 13 and live in the Appalachian Mountains, and half my entire life. This happened about 2 months ago at a popular camp that we go to every summer. So it all started when the troop leader decided to go there for planning the rest of the year. The first night we arrived and went to the lodge and went to bed. The next morning we got most of the planning done, so they let us do whatever on the outbreak. Me and another scout member went fishing at the nearby lake that was a part of the camp. It fed directly from the river, and me and him were fishing on a dock where the river and the lake met. I was sitting on the dock and looked down below since the water was clear to see if I could see a fish. Instead, I saw what I thought was a tree branch that had fallen and was a part of the dock suddenly pull away under the dock. It scared me at first, but when I thought that it could have been in the current, I just continued fishing. After we were done there, me and him changed location. I had a dead crawfish hooked. When I reeled in my lure, it fell off, and I tried to rescue it. I tried to get it at the end of my rod so I could prank another troop member with it. The water was a lot less clear there than it was at the dock, so I felt around for it. Out of nowhere, I felt something jerk on the rod. I almost actually fell in, but luckily, I was firmly planted on the ground. I looked in the water, and I kid you not, a hand was on the end of my rod. I jerked the rod away from whatever the hell this thing was, and in doing so, jerked it so it was closer. I got a good look at the entire thing. It was green in color, with what looked like scales on it. It had fins all over it, and its face is what gives me nightmares. Its face almost looked like a human's face, but it had no nose, and its eyes, well, I don't know if it had eyes, because either it was deep in its head or because all I could see were deep pits and sockets with black inside. It had a snout like a wolf, long needle-like teeth. I quickly got up and ran over to my friend and told him we needed to leave. I made up a quick story since I knew he wouldn't believe me about the creature I saw. So we went back to the lodge. The rest of the trip, I was paranoid. I was so scared that this thing would suddenly come on land afterward and get me. After we left, I have not gone back to that lake because of obvious reasons, nor will I go back to camp there again. I never knew something like that existed until now. So, a while back, probably about 7 or 8 years ago now, I was on a Mothman kick. I did a lot of internet research on the subject, the history, sightings, potential links to other things people have claimed to see. I ended up dragging 2 friends of mine into the mix and got them interested. A short time after the initial interest, maybe a week or 2 later, 2 strange things occurred. We're originally from a seasonal resort town, busy and full of life for around 6 months, then quiet and desolate for the other 6. The entire surrounding area is heavily wooded, with a lot of small roads that go through the woods and small communities. One night in December, we were driving around for the lack of anything better to do. The subject of Mothman had come up several times during the night. We would drive around a bit, mess around, stop, have a cigarette, drive some more, blast music, stop at a convenience store, hang out in the lot, drive more, etc. Anyway, we just stopped at the store, grabbed some drinks, and got back in the car. We started driving and ended up going down this long, dark road in the woods. No houses around, no lots or side roads for another car to come from, just trees as far as you could see. It was kind of a simultaneous reaction. All 3 of us noticed red lights behind us, like tail lights. Almost at first, it was kind of distant, and then it started getting closer, like it was going faster. We all commented on how we were slightly unnerved. Where did that quote-unquote car come from? And when it was about 30 feet away from us, it just disappeared. Gone. We were all freaked out. An hour or so later, we got back to our friend's house. We went upstairs, and we were still talking about the light and how strange it was. And then, from the outside of her house, we could hear a shrill screech. We all froze in fear and looked at each other. We went out on the porch from her room. There was nothing out there, just trees as far as we could see. Was it just some strange, unexplainable coincidence? Or is it something entirely explainable? Was it just some hype from all the Mothman talk? I can't explain the red lights. The screech could have been some sort of animal, maybe. I've never heard anything like that before, though, and I've lived here my entire life. Okay, even if it was something strange, how would it know we were talking about it? And even so, do unexplainable creatures that may or may not exist have nothing better to do than mess with a group of teenagers? I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below, but I do think we might have been chased by Mothman. My husband and I live in Willow Creek, California. Our small town revolves around Bigfoot, and everything here is Bigfoot themed. We even have a cage in case he's ever captured. Our property is 40 acres and surrounded by Forest Service land. We have no neighbors, and we've always felt like we're watched. We barely hear any wildlife and have rarely seen any, despite living in the woods. A couple of separate nights, we've had knocking on our bedroom wall window, and it certainly freaked us out. But we've since brushed it off. Tonight, though, my husband had to take our cord up to the generator above our house to fill our solar panels with water. It was pitch black, and as soon as he turns around the quad and turns it off, he is loudly screamed at by what he was convinced and described to me as a large male humanoid. He did what he had to do and left quickly. He is convinced whatever it was not human, as it's extremely unlikely we have someone else living in the woods. I'm trying to chalk it up as an animal, but it's getting hard to do. You think it sounds like Bigfoot behavior?